Thank you very much, and I also thank the organizers for the invitation, although unlike my colleagues, I didn't have to travel from very far. Well, we haven't really planned this together, who will be talking about what, but it seems to me that I will be either repeating what has already been said or complementing it, hopefully. So I'll try rather complement it than repeat what has already been said. Now, I would like to ask the basic question, which I think for commemorating the Marshall Plan is crucial. And if Marshall Plan basically made the US a European power, the question is, if we commemorate that, is the US still a European power? I will try to show that it is a power, but probably not as a superpower as it used to be. And I will somehow refer to what has already been said, because I think these are good arguments for that. As an academic, I obviously need to start with some definitions. So the question is, if we ask about the US being a European power, first, what is power? And second, what is Europe? Now,
15 minutes, like 15 minutes.
Okay, I've got like up to 15 minutes. I think I will be shorter, so don't worry about that. I believe you do have some sort of idea of what we are referring to. But what I want to somehow claim, if we ask about the US being a European power, we obviously need to distinguish the US being a broader European power or the US being an EU power. And the influence on Europe broad or the outside of the EU Europe is obviously different from the US influence on the EU itself. So I will try to distinguish these two. And I refer here to the previous panel and to Hans Hornat and his argument that basically the US stood at the very beginning of some sort of cooperation in Europe. So that would be the Europe for me, and I will come back to that. What about the power? Obviously, the power is the ability to influence others according to your preferences. That would be the simplest, the most simple way to define it. I don't want to revisit all the debates and all the other definitions, but I think this would be the simplest one, the most simple one. So can the US actually do it? Can the US influence others according to its own preferences? So let's take a look at and let's review the past few years. Let's start with the broader Europe. Now, what do we have in the broader European area? We've got Ukraine. Has the US been able to influence anything? Well, according to its preferences, probably not, unless we actually think that the frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine is a US preference, which I certainly doubt. At least I doubted it half a year ago. I still doubt it is a preference of the US. I'm not sure about the US administration, but the US in general, definitely not. What about the Balkans? Well, Balkans has been somehow deteriorating in the past few years. Has the US anyhow influenced that? No. Has it been in US interest? Well, there I don't really think the problem is that the US wouldn't be able to assert its interest. It's rather that the US is not interested at all. Well, that kind of doesn't make you a power either, right? If you are simply not there. What about the kind of North Africa, closer Middle East? Well, probably the same holds true as my argument with Eastern Europe, with Ukraine. So I don't really think that the US has been able to actually assert its interest and its preference in these particular areas. I'm not really saying that somebody else would be able to do that. But according to how we understand power, the US power is surely not as strong as it probably used to be. Now, let's go to the EU. Okay, the US, what is actually the US preference about the EU? Well, there we probably need to go deeper into the internal debates in the US, because I don't really think that the US properly understands what the EU is, first, in which it is no different from EU member states, by the way. But second, the US is probably not completely united on how it actually sees the European future. And I think some of the speakers have already mentioned that. But we can somehow refer to some stated preferences of the US. one of the clearly stated preferences was that the UK should not leave the European Union. Well, the UK is leaving the European Union. So apparently, on this particular case, the US has not been able to make its point in a way that would influence the behavior of the country. What about the defense spending? Well, yes, we have been talking about that for a long time. Donald Trump has been asserting it for very strongly, but he hasn't been the first one. This has been the US preference for a long, long time, and we haven't seen a change. We have seen a change in some countries in Europe. We have seen change in Estonia, we have seen change in Poland, but these are not countries that would be persuaded to change their approach by the US. They simply feel threatened, and they need to somehow do that for themselves and for their own particular reason, not for the reason of the US pressure. So even on those particular issues that have been really stated clearly and publicly what the US preference is, the EU has not really, or the EU countries haven't really behaved according to what the US would probably prefer. So in that sense, we probably may argue that the US is not very powerful European power. Now, what has already been mentioned here is that the sheer fact of US guarantees, making them some sort of enabler of European cooperation. So basically the US as a guarantor of the EU's existence. And I refer here to the very famous, or for some infamous, article from 1990 by John Mearsheimer, in which he claimed that the world or Europe was entering the new era of balance of power with the end of the Cold War. I visited a couple of years ago at ISA conference a panel which was actually revisiting that, including John Mearsheimer himself. The interesting thing was that there were no American scholars in the room. They were simply not interested. All of them went somewhere else. There were only Europeans sitting there and listening to that particular panel. And John Mearsheimer still claimed that this held true, that the US has not really left Europe because there are still American soldiers in Europe. So in that sense, his prediction will come true only when the American soldiers leave Europe. Now, okay, we don't know. We still have the American soldiers in Europe. So we can't really claim that John Mearsheimer is utterly wrong. But frankly, I have some doubts. I mean, I can't really imagine which sort of balance of power that would actually be. I don't really think that the European countries that have really become so much interdependent would be actually able of balancing each other in those terms that soldiers would actually make a difference to. I mean, there are no soldiers in Europe anymore. We don't have soldiers. I mean, who would be balancing whom? Through which soldiers that we don't have? Our soldiers can't actually leave our country most of the time. We need Americans to bring us elsewhere. So how would we balance each other? Like shouting each other across the border for us? Maybe. I'm not really sure. Now, what about the US as a guarantor of the EU's assistance? Well, it is surely important still. I mean, there is this notion of the Article 5 guarantee, even though the current American president just failed to acknowledge it at a very good opportunity. But I think, disregarding of what he does or does not say publicly, he's not the only one that actually decides in American politics. So I still believe that there is some sort of value in Article 5 and the mutual guarantees. But still, we can see at the European behavior that the Europeans actually have some doubts. Just take a look at what is currently going on at the European level in terms of defense cooperation. And not only at the joint European level, but also bilaterally and unilaterally among European states. Apparently, the Europeans have understood they really need to do something more for their own defense. And I doubt this is because of the US pressure. I rather think this is because they simply start believing that this lack of guarantee is a realistic option. And maybe if not now, in future they actually need to be more autonomous. So this sense of the need for strategic autonomy of the European Union is basically an expression, I think, of rising doubts about whether the US actually wants to remain a European power and still is a European power. And we can see that in the European debates about the defense spending, the establishment of the European Defense Fund. We can see that on bilateral issues such as the activities of the German army to increase bilateral cooperation, which has already been functioning very well with the Dutch. It has just been signed that there is a plan to do that together with Romania and together with the Czech Republic. So apparently there are some activities that really change the situation in defense policy in Europe. So what is the US for the EU? If it is not a European power, my argument would basically be that it counts. It is important. It is first important as a partner, which is obviously somehow a different relationship than there was in the late 40s or early 50s. So as a partner, because still it is the only superpower left yet. So it can't be unimportant on global issues such as Iran, on global issues such as trade. Often, though, it is a nuisance on, again, global issues such as some of the activities of the past war on terror, which for the Europeans were not really considered helpful, I would argue. And on some issues, I would even argue that the US is the other with the capital O, such as climate change. I mean, on climate change, the US is obviously for the Europeans the one that you actually distinguish yourself from. So the US is important for the EU and for the Europeans, but not in the same manner that it used to be. So that would be basically my conclusion. The EU is an important actor. It has influence over Europe's development, but you can argue the same about China or Russia, obviously, and nobody really expects China to be a European power. But it is not the spiritus agens that it actually used to be in the time of the Marshall Plan. Thank you very much.